Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. Thanks for coming out for Politics in the Pub. We really appreciate you coming out tonight, and I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting tonight. It's Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend this welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are in the room this evening, and ask us all to reflect on what we can do to support the referendum that's coming up, what I think is going to be pretty soon, and the campaign for a voice to be in the Constitution, a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. We do love hosting Politics in the Pub. We love getting you all out to talk about politics and bring some of Australia's best politicians right to you, but they aren't free to put on, even though we make them free for you to attend. So if you can chip in a donation, we would really appreciate it. It helps us keep running these evenings for you. We've got a tap and go donation box up on the bar and another box for cash donations at the back, and all donations are gratefully received. Thank you very much. So as you might remember, very recently the government released the State of the Environment report, which the previous government had been sitting on. And what it really showed is that Australia's environmental laws are broken. There's a lot to pore over in this report. And what's important to note is that the laws are so broken that they don't even allow for the government to assess the emissions and the climate change impacts of projects. So in the wake of this devastating State of the Environment report, the Greens are urging the Albanese Government to stop approving new mines and developments in threatened species habitats, which threaten extinction for a number of species. So I am delighted to have with us tonight Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, who has introduced the Climate Trigger Bill, and she's here to tell us all about it. Please give a big round of applause to Senator Sarah Hanson-Young.
Thank you.
Sarah, to start off, I just wonder if you can paint a picture for us of just how dire that State of the Environment report was. How are things looking for Australia's environment?
Well, thanks, Ebony, and it's wonderful to be here and wonderful to see so many people out interested in this issue on a Wednesday night. Look, none of you would be surprised that the state of Australia's environment is in dire straits. Extinction is rising of our native species. In fact, we lead the world when it comes to the rate of species loss, particularly amongst mammals. Some of our most iconic species, wildlife, are on the endangered list, and the koala being one of the most prominent. And it is just unthinkable that we are facing a world right now where in less than 3 decades, the koala might be extinct because we haven't been able to protect its habitat. Hundreds of birds, Australian birds, are on the extinction list. Thousands of species are facing extinction. And what is crucial in this State of Environment report, which happens every 5 years, it's not something that the government out of goodwill does. It's something they're required to commission. It is independent. And it's a very thick report. I didn't actually bring it with me because it is a big, thick thing. But one of the most important things out of this report this time is the very clear and direct connection to the biggest damage being done to our environment is being fueled by the climate crisis. And of course there's that dual challenge, because the more the climate crisis drives the threat to the environment, the more environment and habitat loss, biodiversity loss we have. You can see that from the bushfires, those hectares and hectares and hectares of habitat loss from the bushfires, which then made climate change even worse. That made biodiversity loss even worse, and the vicious cycle goes on. So this was the first time where the climate crisis was really pinpointed as the driving force. And we talk a lot about, and we've had a lot of debates in the Parliament about the climate challenge, but very little is debated and spoken about in terms of biodiversity loss and particularly species loss. And we're now at a point, and this is what the report says, is that it's not just enough actually to be protecting what's left. We desperately have to start restoring biodiversity as well. And I think that is really important in this whole conversation, because every time you hear the government talk about, well, we'll just impact on this bit of habitat, but that's okay because we'll protect this bit over here, doing a deal between habitats or species, what we're missing is that we are going further and further down the ledger of debt when it comes to biodiversity loss. So we actually have to be restoring.
Yeah, I was just reading today, you're talking about the habitat loss and the species loss, a new report out saying that about half of the world's birds are under threat, which I just found extraordinary. And I'm sure Canberra people will remember, and Sarah, from your early days in the Senate, the bogong moth, migration that we used to see that used to swamp Canberra all the time. And insects even, you just don't see that in the environment anymore. So things are really kind of at a very crucial point where it's visible to us.
Absolutely. I think the moth is a really good example because, we talk about the koala being so iconic and it's nice and cuddly and it's beautiful. But when we think about the impact of insects in particular, it's right before our eyes, except it's in plain sight, hidden in plain sight. And again, the bushfires have had a significant impact on that, particularly in this area. But climate change is driving this. And Parliament House is not swamped by those moths anymore. You don't see them. And in the 15 years that I've been in the federal parliament, that has been a significant real decline that you can pinpoint.
So I want to come now to the actual EPBC, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. And as you've pointed out, it does not cover in the environment laws assessment of new coal and gas projects for their emissions, or really the emissions of any project just don't come into that assessment that the government normally does. Why is that so damaging?
Well, firstly, isn't that crazy? We've got these environment laws and an expansion of a coal mine, let's say in the Hunter Valley. The proponents have to put forward an application. It has to be assessed by the Environment Department. The minister, the federal minister, has to sign off on it. But nowhere in that assessment does the minister have to consider the climate damage and the pollution that mine is going to create. So when you hear the minister or members of the government say, well, we'll only sign off on the expansion of fossil fuel projects after rigorous environmental assessment. The truth is that at the moment under law, there is no rigorous environmental assessment that includes climate damage, that includes climate pollution. So it's all a furphy. We need to fix that. And this State of the Environment report shows very clearly that the driving challenge and damage to our biodiversity and our wildlife is climate change, and it's going to keep happening. So we have to take that into account, stop making climate change worse, and make sure we have environment laws that actually assess the climate damage before any green light is given to a big project. So our climate trigger bill would amend the current laws to ensure that projects that create a significant amount of pollution, it needs to be upfront and put forward, and the proponents need to admit how much pollution, how much damage their projects are going to create, and then the minister needs to consider whether that still warrants approval. For those big projects that are going to create the most amount of pollution, over 100,000 tonnes, we say it's a no-go zone. Between 25, and this is getting a little bit technical, but between 25,000 tonnes and up to 100, we're saying, well, at the very least, the minister needs to consider whether that is in the best interests, whether that is something that is worthwhile signing off on. But at least there is some transparency around the process and around how much pollution these projects are going to take, which at the moment, none of that is taken into consideration.
It is quite shocking that it's 2022 and there's still nothing in our environment laws on that.
And look, I think it's a great amendment that's needed and an important reform to our environment laws. But I've got to be honest, Ebony, I'm not the person who came up with this idea first. In 2005, when Anthony Albanese was the shadow environment minister, he proposed a climate trigger bill himself to fix this exact problem. And he said there is a gap in our environment laws that are making damage to our environment worse because of climate change, and we need to fix it. So I've pointed out to the now Prime Minister, he was right then and he's right now, and why don't we work together to get it done?
I love this spirit of collaboration. That's wonderful. That's what we like to see in this new Parliament with a climate supermajority. Hopefully we can get it done.
And look, I think that is something that is become a part of the narrative and the talk about how our Parliament looks and the impact of the vote since the election. I don't think it's something we should just paper over. It is significant. The message that was sent to political parties and to us as parliamentarians from voters right across the country was that climate change and nature are more important to people as topics of concern than ever before. It was a climate election, and the Parliament is now made up of a group, broad spread between the Greens, Independents, Teals, and I would argue those members of the Labor Party who said they too wanted to take climate action. It is a supermajority for climate, and we can't just ignore that. We actually have to do something about it. And so while we have passed the 43% emission reduction target bill, and the Greens worked hard to strengthen that, and we worked with Labor to pass that. And it is, in most aspects, symbolic. And symbolism matters. It really actually does matter. It sends a signal to everybody, to business, to industry, to the community that this is important. But now what we need is the elements in place to actually make sure we don't just cut pollution, we stop creating more pollution.
I wanted to ask about a related piece of legislation or a thing that currently exists, which is the safeguards mechanism, which is also getting a lot of talk about it at the moment in the national policy space. It's supposed to be regulating high polluting industries and facilities. It hasn't been doing a very good job of it, partly because it's voluntary and partly perhaps because it was, dare I suggest it, designed not to be effective. But again, it really doesn't take into account new gas and coal mines or any mechanism to assess them or to stop them. Do you see your climate trigger bill as doing the work that the safeguards mechanism currently isn't?
It definitely will do the work. The safeguards mechanism and the government, the Labor government, is going through the process of reviewing that at the moment. They've taken on commitment that they will come up with a new scheme, a improved scheme. We will see the draft of that by the end of the year, and it'll be put to the Parliament early next year. But to date, we are concerned that unless that prohibits the expansion of the fossil fuel industry, not just dealing with and regulating the pollution that is already in the pipeline and being created, whether it's from the fossil fuel industry directly or from those other parts of industry that are emissions intensive, then it's not really going to be doing its job of reducing and keeping pollution down to reduce temperatures and keep them below 1.5 degrees, which is what we know the science requires. So at this point, look, we are holding our position and hoping that the government will come up with a safeguards mechanism that is strong enough to really drive pollution down. But unless there is a mechanism for stopping the opening of new coal and gas into the future, then we're actually we're not cutting pollution. There's an argument that we get to net zero, we can just maybe we could just offset everything. The problem we have is that we have too much pollution in the system as it is. We have to cut it. We can't just keep trading it off.
Before we go further into new coal and gas developments, because I'd like to stick with that, I did just want to ask about any other weaknesses in the environment laws, because I know in the past, for example, if we're thinking about habitat destruction, regional forestry agreements have always been excluded from needing to, I guess, care or do anything about habitat loss and the threats to native species. Are there any other weaknesses that you're concerned about in the environment protection laws that you'd like to see Labor tackling?
Well, you mentioned the regional forest agreements. I mean, that's another ridiculous carve out of our environment laws, that the logging of native forests does not trigger an assessment as to whether that particular coup or that project should go ahead under the federal environment laws. That is crazy. We should not be in 2022 in this country when we are facing huge extinction loss, an enormous pressure on biodiversity, the impact of climate change, of which we know a big part of that is restoring and protecting biodiversity. We should not be allowing the continuation of logging of native forests. It is bonkers. It is just, it's unthinkable, actually. So yes, that needs to be fixed. And of course we know there are the forces that continue to rail against getting rid of native forest logging. There's a lot of self-interest and vested interest in state governments in relation to this. I mean, it is crazy that the taxpayer in many places are actually the ones subsidising the very industries that continue to log native forests, kind of like the taxpayers who are continuing to subsidise the fossil fuel industry through the various budget measures. Like, it is there is a moment where we have to go, hang on, if we are serious about how the situation that we are in, the climate damage that we are facing, the loss and damage to nature and environment and where we live, the impact on clean air, clean water and clean soil for our food, then we actually have to stop giving carve-outs and giving excuses to continue the industries that are making things worse. So forest agreements, absolutely. But one of the other real weaknesses in the system is that there is no kind of oversight of the accumulation of the impact of destroying particular habitats or the threat on a particular species. So while an assessment might be, a project might be given the green light over here, it is given without understanding that over there, that particular species is being threatened as well. And so we need to, and that's what this State of the Environment report shows, is that there is not a bird's eye view. Things are done piecemeal, and so therefore the biodiversity loss and the impact on our species is accelerating at a rate because nobody is really watching the board. And at some point we're going to turn around and go, where is everything? And it's because we lost it here, and we lost it here, and we lost it here, and we tried to protect it here, but we got this bit protected, but over there that went at the same time. So there is no overarching view that this biodiversity impact, the habitat loss, the impact that is having on our wildlife is feeding on itself.
I did want to pick up what you were just saying about subsidies there. So the Australia Institute has done quite a lot of work around identifying the billions of dollars that go every year in subsidies to fossil fuels from both federal and state governments. The number is huge, but the Greens recently commissioned the Parliamentary Budget Office to identify, in particular, some federal gas subsidies. Can you tell us about what they identified and what you're calling on the government to do?
We know that there are billions of dollars in subsidies through various programs in the federal budget given to the fossil fuel industry each year. And one of the elements that we have found is there's $2 billion worth of subsidies that were promised but have not been contracted. So there's no reason why they can't be junked. And we've heard a lot from the Labor government over the last few months about this coming budget in a few weeks' time in October, looking at all the waste that was in the previous government's budget. And you keep hearing that all the time. They're going through it with a fine-tooth comb to cut out the waste. Well, we've found $2 billion of waste. It is to subsidise fossil fuel industries, as you say, Ebony, under mostly under gas. Remember when Scott Morrison said that the way out of COVID was the gas industry? It was going to be gas-led recovery. That's gone well. I think the figures actually from the Australia Institute showed that people actually lost their jobs in the gas industry since out of COVID, not gained employment. So that's gone well. Quite a bit of that money has been spent, but $2 billion hasn't. So it's been committed, it's sitting in the budget. What we're saying is redirect that. It shouldn't be going to subsidise the gas industry. Projects like expanding the Beetaloo Basin and fracking in the Beetaloo Basin. It shouldn't be going to opening up the Scarborough Gas Project in WA. And it shouldn't be going to funding the roads and infrastructure of these big gas companies that, frankly, if they can't stand on their own 2 feet, the last thing we should be doing is propping them up. And it's interesting in relation to Beetaloo because a bulk of the money that has been put aside to help companies open up in Beetaloo, by the way, if that happened, there's no way we would reach the net zero, the 43% reduction target, and there's no way we would get to net zero if we opened up the Beetaloo Basin. We can't. That would blow our carbon budget. But Origin Energy, of course, recently said that they would, get out of the Beetaloo Basin. So I'm saying to the government, well, there's $2 billion here that was promised by the Morrison government. It hasn't been spent. Let's redirect it into protecting biodiversity or investing in renewable energy, making renewable energy power cheaper for households and businesses. Because if even Origin Energy doesn't think it's worth it, why should we be throwing public money after this?
It's such an important point, and one that I feel like the Greens have a big distinction from the Labor government when it comes to climate. Obviously, there's been a huge focus prior to the election on climate, on Labor's 43% target bill, which is now passed, but this idea that we can keep just expanding our fossil fuel industry endlessly, the Greens have really led the charge against that, and it's hard to argue against.
It's so interesting. I feel like often we're in this parallel universe because when you engage with other members of parliament, other NGOs, government agencies overseas. I went to Glasgow last year during the climate COP negotiations, and it was so clear in that environment that governments, activists, scientists, civil society members were all saying we should not be funding and subsidising fossil fuels anymore. One, we can't afford to expand the industry. We've got to deal with the transition in front of us, and some people have different views on how fast that can happen, what needs to happen to help that, what incentives need to be put in place to help that. But everybody, by and large, if you accept that we have to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees, says you can't keep expanding. And then if you can't keep expanding, then the last thing we should be doing is spending public money subsidising these industries. The International Energy Agency says no more fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, the Pope says no more new fossil subsidies.
Pretty mainstream.
Maybe that's the amendment we need to put in, as the Pope says.
Before we go to questions from the audience, and I will ask everyone to start thinking of your questions now, we do have a microphone up the front here, and we'll ask you to line up here to ask questions of Sarah. But Sarah, there was two more things that I wanted to ask you about. The first one is this idea of a green Wall Street to restore our environment and protect biodiversity. Not that I think Wall Street, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, how much of a great reputation does Wall Street have in this room? No? What do the Greens think of this idea of a green Wall Street?
Well, of course, this relates to the ability for effectively trading the protection or the investment in restoring biodiversity. We haven't seen all the details. This is a proposal being put forward by the government. We haven't seen all the details yet. And look, I am in a genuine, I come from the genuine position that we are facing such a huge crisis, extinction crisis. Our environment is at breaking point. We need to be doing everything we possibly can right now. So I'm willing to consider what options are put on the table, but it must be robust, it must have integrity, and it must actively and deliberately drive the protection of biodiversity and the restoration of biodiversity. If it doesn't do those things, then what are we doing it for? And I'm concerned that there's been a lot of debate, of course, and I'm sure in this room, because I know the Australia Institute has done a lot of work in this area, that the offsets program in relation to carbon has come under scrutiny. There's questions around the legitimacy and the integrity of that type of program. I would want to make sure that any program that is put in place at the heart of it has the protection, biodiversity, and the restoration there. It is. I'm not interested in people just making money off nature. I'm interested in how people can spend money to protect nature.
Can I ask people to start coming up now if you've got questions for Sarah? And I've just got this one last one for you. Sarah came to us straight from the Senate tonight. And was just headed out of the chamber just before she came to speak to you all tonight. And the big thing in the Parliament this week is obviously ICAC. What is the Greens' assessment so far of the ICAC legislation that the Attorney General has introduced?
Well, firstly, we have to stop calling it ICAC and we have to start calling it the NAC. So I'm sure there is a lot of jokes we could make about that. But the National Anti-Corruption Commission bill has been introduced into the House today. We've just had a vote in the Senate to make sure it can go off to a robust inquiry to go through the details to make sure any of the loopholes and the weaknesses can be identified and fixed. Let me say firstly, again, this is only happening because everyday people in the community were sick and tired of seeing corruption and misbehaviour of their politicians in plain sight. The overwhelming support from the community to fix and put in place a national anti-corruption body was so palpable at the election and still is. So we need this piece of legislation. We need this commission put in place. But what we need to make sure is that it will be able to do the things that it should do. We are concerned that some of the elements have been watered down from what the experts over the years have proposed. we want to make sure that it is able to investigate and launch its own investigations, not just things that are referred to it by the government of the day. We need to make sure that it can investigate off the basis of whistleblowers and protection for whistleblowers, because unless we have protection for whistleblowers, this will fall down. And we know that across a variety of our existing laws, protection for whistleblowers is so weak. And of course, Bernard Collaery, a very important example of how badly some of those protection laws have been. And of course, there is the issue in relation to third parties and whether third parties can be caught up in this process. They must be able to be held to account as well. And public hearings. Public hearings should be the rule, and private hearings should only be the exception.
Hear, hear.
It should not be the other way around.
Hear, hear.
So these are things we're going to push for. We are a little bit concerned that if the Labor government decides to simply work with the Dutton opposition, we are, let me say, sceptical of the strength that this will deliver for this anti-corruption commission. I hope that Labor have the the foresight to work with the crossbench, the independents and the Greens, to make sure we deliver something that the public actually called for, voted for and want. So we're going to work hard to do that.
Thank you, Sarah. We'll go now to questions from the audience, and if I could just ask our questioners to make sure it's a question and not a statement. If I can echo Tony Jones from the early days of Q&A, and I can see we're going to have a number of questions tonight, so if you could keep it as brief as possible, we'd appreciate it. Our first question, thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wonder, are you looking into the effect of the widespread use of insecticides and herbicides and so on farms are having on our biodiversity? Thank you.
I haven't had a look at that specifically, but I think it's a really important point to be raised, and I think it's a significant point to be raised actually in this conversation about how we work with those in the agricultural communities and industries in relation to the incentives or the scheme designed to protect and restore the environment. I think it's well placed to have a conversation there. I do know, of course, that numerous communities who live throughout the Murray-Darling Basin, this always comes up. What is the impact of pesticides and chemicals on not just the soil and species, but on water quality? And again, so much over the last decade, not only have we seen an attack on the environment through kind of a watering down of laws, but the lack of funding and resources to data, to research, to science. We need to turn this on its head. I am concerned that at this point, in the October budget, we're going to see very little from this government in relation to rebalancing what has been an underfunding and constant cuts to funding of the environment. But I'm hopeful that through the process like this, that we can raise voices and concerns so that there is pressure on the government beyond this to make sure that they do fund proper research and at least data collection. I think there is just such a lack of understanding. And when we have reports like the State of the Environment report, and it says every 5 years things are getting worse, we need to be making sure that the minister on a regular basis and the public on a regular basis has access to the data so that we can be informed about the decisions that are being made.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, thanks. With the climate trigger, what do you see as the politics? Do you think that Labor will support the Greens legislation? And if not, how do you think it'll go? Will between the Greens and the Teal, do you think you can push it through? And then finally, do you think it will prevent major new gas and coal projects from going ahead?
Thank you. If the legislation was to get up and was to pass the parliament, it will definitely stop those major gas and coal projects, without a doubt. It will stop them. How do we get there and how do we get that done is going to require significant negotiation. I'm very thankful and hopeful that this isn't just something that the Greens are pushing for. I know David Pocock, of course, one of your senators here in the ACT, has been very supportive of my climate trigger bill. So I'm working closely with David to make sure we continue to push this. There is a couple of key moments where the Labor government are going to need the Greens' support. Safeguard mechanisms bill and their overarching and review to environment laws. The minister and the Labor minister and the government did commit at the last election to review Australia's environment laws. They've said over the next 12 to 18 months that will happen. Well, this must be in there. Well, I'm not precious about it having to be, the Hanson-Young bill. What I want is the amendments to the laws that actually fix the problem. So, I'm happy for the government to pick up the laws that I've drafted and put them in. I'm also more than happy to talk to them about a process or amendments if they think that it's needed.
Thank you. Our next question. Feel free to adjust the microphone there.
Thank you. Can I? Oh, yeah. It was really refreshing reading the Greens' economic policy for fixing the environment and its plans, or I guess desires, to implement a circular economy, mainly because it's my personal belief that the economy kind of does need to be restructured in order to kind of fight the climate crisis. I was more wondering, do you think if a circular economy is implemented that it would go far enough?
Well, we've got a lot of work to do, don't we? Look, we do have to strive for a reduction in pollution, and it's not obviously just carbon pollution. Methane is something that the government doesn't want to talk about. It is really going to supercharge the climate crisis over the next decade. We need to get onto that. Yes, we need to be protecting the environment and we need to be doing that. When we talk about the circular economy, what I am hopeful of is that more people than ever before, one, want to live sustainably, two, are concerned about the impact of the products that they're buying, where their money is invested. They want governments to be acting responsibly. And I think this is all part of the conversation. Is it going to be enough? We're not even at the point at the moment where we're not funding using public money to make the problem worse. We're spending public money subsidising fossil fuels. We're spending public money allowing the destruction of habitat of native species. So I don't want to jump too far ahead, actually. I just like to stop making things worse and then start focusing on how we can fix the stuff that we've already broken.
Thank you. Next question.
Sarah, thank you so much for coming out and talking with us tonight. I'm just interested in water, and particularly the Murray-Darling Basin water management, which $13 billion, and I've got no idea where it's actually gone. And
I was hoping you'd be able to tell me.
Yeah. New South Wales is going to renege. Victoria is talking about reneging. What's the Greens' position and what should Parliament be doing about it?
It's a very good question, and I think it's, look, no surprise on my view on this, not only as a Green but as a South Australian. I live at the end of the river system. Adelaide still takes the bulk of its drinking water from the Murray-Darling Basin. It is an issue for our state that is so, it's not just parochial, it is the most politically charged. And for a reason, because decades and decades, and there's this mindset that, oh well, doesn't matter what happens downstream, as long as we get to, get all the water we need up here. It's an easy argument to run, upstream versus downstream, but when you live at the bottom end of the system, you can't help but have that constantly driving the discussion. The Murray-Darling Basin Plan, you're right, $13 billion was committed to this reform. And what we have is we are running up against the clock. 2024 is when the plan is meant to have all been delivered. We are missing hundreds of gigalitres of water that has never been delivered through that system. The environment, it's hard to talk about at the moment because there's so much rain in some areas of the country, but the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is there not for in the good times. The point was to put in place a sustainable river management system for when things are bad. And as climate change is getting worse, things are going to get bad. They're going to get terrible. And we are going to be faced with crippling drought in the Murray-Darling Basin again. And at this point, we've spent $13 billion and have not recovered the amount of water that science requires for us to keep the river alive. I'm very, very worried about where this will go. The only option I think the federal government has at this point is to put buybacks back on the table and to get out into the market and start buying water from willing sellers for the environment and banking those licenses for the environment. It strikes me that the constant tearing down of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan by Barnaby Joyce and the National Party has won at this point. And the only way we stop that is by standing up and saying, no, we promise we'd deliver 3,200 gigalitres of water back to the environment, which, by the way, was below, it was the bare minimum that the scientists actually said we'd need. So it's the bare minimum, and we're still not even delivering that. But there was a commitment for 3,200 gigalitres, and whatever that gap ends up being, we need to buy that water back.
Thank you. That's rather a sobering assessment of where things are at, isn't
Sorry.
it? No, it's because you're right. We're in La Nina at the moment and about to go into another summer, but an El Nino is probably not too far behind.
Let me put it into perspective for you. South Australia and the river system in South Australia was promised 450 gigalitres of water. Guess how much has been returned to the river of that? 2 gigalitres. So when South Australians stand up and say we're pretty pissed off at all the people upstream, that's why.
Fair enough too.
And I'm not going to take my parochial hat off here because I can't. But let me say, what is good for getting the water down to the end of the system is good for the environment. You need the water to flow. You need the Murray mouth open to flush out that salt. What is good, if the bottom of the system is healthy, the entire system will be healthy. And that's the principle that I take and continue to fight for.
Thanks very much. Next question.
I also have a water question, sorry, but I'm just going to throw in a short positive before that, though, on fossil fuel subsidies. The investors that look after all of our superannuation assets, the Investor Group on Climate Change, put their policy out today. They also agree, no fossil fuel subsidies. Why are we paying for that? But my question, which is connected to the water question, back to the Kosciuszko National Park. It's a national park. We can't even protect that from the feral horses that are in there that are destroying the source of 3 major rivers. Which of these legislations, or what are the options for actually legislating and protecting our national park?
Well, I think this comes back to what is the strength of our environment laws and what are they there for? And they are so weak. Beyond just the State of the Environment report, prior to that last year, or 2 years ago, was the release of the Samuels report. And that was a report, Graham Samuels was commissioned to run an analysis and a review of the actual environment laws of the country. And that assessment was devastating. The laws are too weak, they're not protecting what they're meant to be protecting, and in fact, they're actually allowing incredible loopholes that are driving species loss. So I think issues like this, as the government reviews their environment laws, we need to make sure we are talking about what are we doing about invasive species, what are we doing when we talk about national parks, what are national parks, what are they for, and overarchingly it comes back to this idea of I'm concerned that there isn't even an agenda to protect what we've got, let alone restore what's already been damaged. And we have to be getting to the restoration impact. You talked about being positive, and I'm sorry, Eb, I'm generally a really positive person. I couldn't be in politics if I wasn't actually. What's the point of doing this job if you don't have an optimistic view that you can change things and that you can fix things? And I must say, despite the challenges that we have, I am more optimistic than I've ever been that the community wants us to be putting nature front and centre and wants nature to be given a much louder stakeholder voice in these public and political discussions. And I reflect on during COVID and the lockdowns. I think that period really forced many of us to think about what we hold dear, about the environment that we're in. I saw in my own community people spending more time out in nature than I'd ever seen before. I live on the edge of a national park in the Adelaide Hills, and often I run out there every day when I'm home, and it's often I only see 2 or 3 people. And then all of a sudden in the middle of COVID, the national park was full of families enjoying being together in nature. I think there has been a reconnection between community, individual and nature, and we have to use that, and we have to protect that, and we have to strengthen that. And it's not just my own reflection. Even the president of the EU in her State of the Nation address a couple of weeks ago, in her list of priorities of where the EU is in the rest of the world and their big priorities, and they've got the invasion of the Ukraine on their doorstep. And she said very clearly, one of our key priorities is that we need to make nature our first ally. And I think that's a really powerful sentiment for us all to take on.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, thank you, Sarah, Ebony. Really interesting evening. So back on the climate trigger bill, fossil fuel companies can propose that they're going to deal with their emissions by buying carbon credits or investing in emissions reduction or renewable energy projects to offset the emissions. So, for example, the WA's Environment Protection Authority recommended approval of Woodside's proposed extension of the Northwest Shelf, saying that it was all good because Woodside said they'd offset a chunk of the hundreds of millions of tonnes of emissions that the operation will cause. How does the climate trigger bill deal with this issue of offsets as a get out of jail free card for polluters, and is there a risk that this offsets shaped loophole may be carved out in the bill?
Thank you for that question. And I think there is rightly a lot of concern about the use of offsets, and this kind of, oh, well, we can do this over here if we can buy some carbon credits or get a nice gold star over here. In some ways and in some industries, that is going to, and as part of the transition, there is going to have to be the existence of offsets. But that must be the last resort. You first have to reduce your emissions and your pollution and be driving away from these, creating more pollution. Offsets should be a last resort, not the first resort. And I think that has been a big part of the problem. And of course, then the offsets have to have integrity, and there is a review at the moment of the offsets program, So I'm looking forward to seeing how the government reacts to that. The climate trigger bill is not about offsets. The climate trigger bill is about the assessment of projects. So the offset program, which would be facilitated and is currently by the safeguard mechanism bill, is a separate law and a separate process. Our climate trigger bill is about the assessment and whether people can, whether the minister is able and allowed to sign off on projects if they are creating too much pollution. Over 100,000, you can't offset that, you can't build it, which is why the answer to the fellow earlier is this will stop the expansion and the building of new big coal and gas projects.
Thank you. Next question.
Sarah, we've heard about chemical pollution, and of course it's not just agricultural chemicals. So what do we need to do to better regulate the chemical industry? And if I could add to that, the damage to our environment caused by the huge amounts of waste created by our society, and I know that the circular economy is a great idea, but plastic waste, of course, is a huge problem, especially in our oceans. What can we do about that?
Waste is a huge environmental has a huge environmental impact, of course, and I mean it's crazy, isn't it, that we're burning fossil fuels to create plastics to pollute our oceans. I mean, that's one kind of circular economy, isn't it? We need to undo that. The government, I think, rightly so, is considering their response to how we do waste management. I know Peter Wish-Wilson, my colleague from Tasmania, is very passionate about waste management, and that's his over in his area. He's very determined to continue to put proper waste management and circular economy front and centre. But you asked what we can do about reducing the chemical pollution in the first place. Comes back to, again, our current laws are so weak that they are just not assessing the right things. They're not taking into consideration the accumulation of the impacts on threatened species, on habitat loss. So we need to start making sure we can see the whole picture so we can identify where the gaps are, what the problem is, and then be able to address that. At the moment, things are just in silos, and so it's just there is no way of the minister to be able to deal with issues like that. So it has to be part of the whole review.
I can see we've got 2 questions left and not that long, so I might ask if you can ask your questions just one after the other, and then Sarah, hopefully you can tackle them both. Yeah. Thank you. Next question.
Hi, Sarah. My question's around your note about halting new developments and mines where there's threatened species habitats. Yeah. In the context of needing to replace fossil fuels with a rapid growth of renewable energy projects, how do we balance, I guess, the need for a rapid upscale of new projects for the renewable energy economy with, I guess, balancing those local threatened species issues?
And sorry, and I'll just get that last question.
Sorry, it's not related to that one at all. In a slightly different flavour for the night, I'm curious to hear what you think are opportunities and challenges in the ethos of emissions reduction, restoring, the environment, etc., for our urban and built environments, and how that connects with the natural environment that people often think about when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Both really good questions. The first one. In relation to, we're going to drive this transition, we've got to get on with it, right? But we do need to be sensitive, and we do need to be making sure we're not making the situation worse, not just with carbon pollution or methane pollution, but of course with the impact on biodiversity, which is why we need more robust laws. We obviously, the expansion of, or the building of a new mine, should have to consider its own pollution impacts of the mine itself. So I think this climate trigger bill would actually drive green industry, renewable powered, much greener capture of and capping of leakage, for example. They're the types of elements that need to be considered. If a proponent wants to build a big project, they need to consider their environment impact. So I actually feel that this will help drive the green industry transition that we need, whether it's manufacturing or whether it is in the resources sector. It will give those that are doing the right thing, those that are investing in that transition, those that are making their resource process cleaner, it gives them an edge because they're the ones that are going to be able to get the approval. And yes, we do need to be considering the impact on habitat and the place where these things are in and of themselves. I don't think when we have the koala on the endangered list right now, facing extinction over the next 3 decades, that we can turn a blind eye and say, oh, but we really need this mine. Find somewhere else for it, or find an alternative. I mean, we are either serious about protecting and putting a halt to extinction loss, or we're not. And we talk about, a lot of the commitment to driving pollution down and cutting pollution has been about targets. An emissions reduction target of 43%, of 75%, of getting to net zero. What I really want to see happen in Australia is a discussion about when are we going to have a target for stopping the extinction of our animals and our species, because you need that type of commitment to drive the transition, whether it's in the resources industry or in manufacturing. The
Built environment.
The built environment. We need to green our cities and our suburbs and our towns, and we need government to be part of that, working with community, working with local governments, working with state governments to do that. One of the projects that I would love to see in my own town, and perhaps could be something that you take up here in the ACT, is Shane Rattenbury in the room? So in Adelaide we have the River Torrens. It runs right through the middle of our city. I want to make that swimmable. It used to be. It used to be clean enough to swim in. People used to enjoy it. We used to it wasn't polluted. We could be driving the cleanup of our environment within our built environment and making it more livable, making it more sustainable, and making it more fit for what inevitably is already a changing climate. And so on a hot summer's day in Adelaide, or it may end up being a hot winter's day, given the change, I'd like to be able to know that kids at the local school can go down and jump in the clean river. And the flow-on effect to those types of projects is the greening of our parks, the greening of our suburbs, the capturing of the stormwater, the recycling of the stormwater, the cleaning out of the pollutants that flow into the river system. So I think you have to start at that end of the journey, and there are particular projects that I think can drive that if governments are committed to it.
Everyone, please put your hands together for the Greens Water and Environment Spokesperson, Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks, Ebony, and thanks for having me, everyone. It's been lovely to be here.
Before you head off, I just want a couple of reminders. Our next event is going to be on Wednesday, the 9th of November, and in the wake of the massive Optus data breach and whistleblower revelations about how damaging social media is to democracy and in particular to young people, we're going to be talking to Jordan Giao about his new book, Disconnect, Why We Get Pushed to Extremes Online and How to Stop It. I think it'll be really relevant, and we should have books of his for sale on that night. So I hope you can come along to that in November. A special thanks tonight to the staff at Verity Lane Market for making our event tonight possible. We love the venue here. and we hope that you eat something delicious downstairs and grab a drink before you go. Thank you again for coming out tonight. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money. This week's episode, we dig into why the government needs to dump the stage 3 income tax cuts. Giant waste of $243 billion. And lastly, if I can just thank all the Australia Institute staff who make these evenings possible. That is the amazing team of Hannah Brown, Hayden Starr, and Eleanor Johnston-Leake. Thank you very much, guys. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time tonight.